Welcome everyone again to Machine Learning and Friends, and I'll have to introduce our speaker for today.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. So I'm delighted to introduce David Burt. David's a postdoc at MIT working with Tamara Broderick. He did his PhD with Carl Rasmussen at Cambridge. I think I first saw David when he was giving a talk at ICML 2019, which I think was maybe relatively early in his grad school, maybe his very first paper, which I think won the best paper award at ICML 2019. So that's a pretty good way to start. Since then, he's been doing a lot of interesting work on a topic which is really important, which is like what to do if your data is not IID, which of course no data actually is IID, but especially when you're working in things like spatial settings like in ecology or epidemiology, which are areas that I find are important to me, then this comes up actually all the time. So he's going to share some about that with us today. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk primarily about a basic check we propose if you have data with spatial structure. And this is a check for methods for validating the quality of the predictions. We'll then talk through a few existing methods that we show don't satisfy this kind of basic check. And then I'll introduce a method that does. So as a motivating problem, we'll think of this question as what is the impact of air pollution on hospital admissions in rural communities? So on the, I guess you're right, I have a map of the US, and on it I've labeled in red, hopefully you can see those, these critical access hospitals, which are an important part of rural healthcare systems. And the problem we run into is a problem that you run into a lot in spatial statistics if you want to answer kind of questions like this, which is that you don't actually have data available everywhere in space. And so now in yellow, I'm showing the air pollution monitors, which are places where we actually get to observe the air pollution. And often these are clustered in cities. There tend to be less in rural areas because of how the government cites them. And in particular, we don't get to observe the air pollution at these hospitals. So while I'm talking in the context of air pollution, this problem comes up a lot. As Dan mentioned, there's like ecology problems. You usually also don't get to observe your data everywhere over space. I think this is a lot of problems in economics, or as it happens. So a really popular approach that's appearing, I think, more and more in the literature is to combine some other data source, often things like remote sensing data, maybe also emissions inventories or land use variables, with some form of machine learning or AI or statistics to fill in the gaps. So basically you take this other data source and then you predict air pollution kind of across the whole US, for example, and then you can use these predicted air pollutions in your study downstream. And the immediate question we run into is kind of, does this work? So we're going to make a bunch of predictions and we want to know, are these predictions any good? Should we trust them? Are they good enough for use in some downstream study? We also might have multiple ways of making these predictions and we might want to be able to choose between. And these are all tools where we would typically do some form of validation. So some form of checking how good our predictions are against real data that we didn't use in building the models to see kind of how well we're doing at making these predictions. The problem we run into in these spatial settings is that the data isn't independent and identically distributed, which is a really common assumption when you do validation. So if you think, for example, about the locations of these hospitals, they're not really independent in a meaningful way. Like probably if you were to go and place a new hospital, you wouldn't place it next to an existing rural hospital. They're also kind of just fixed points in some sense, in the sense that like these are the hospitals that we might have available, for example, for a study. There's not like a meaningful population of hospitals they're sampled from. In some sense, the same is true of these air pollution monitors. They're certainly not cited independently of each other. So these locations are kind of, maybe better thought of as fixed locations where we want to make inferences and where we have data available to check how we're doing. So what we show in the work I'm going to talk about is that a bunch of commonly used validation methods, including what's commonly referred to as a holdout, which is probably the most familiar way of doing validation, where you just calculate your error on data that wasn't used to train your model, as well as methods designed for covariate-shift and also approaches like spatial walking, can lead to inaccurate estimates of model error, and in particular can do things like select worse predictors when you're trying to select between predictors using validation. We also show, and this I'm not going to talk about in a ton of detail in this talk, but I want to touch on, that if you're interested in doing things like inferring associations, so for example, the main overarching question, in the main overarching question we're asking, there's like association we would want to infer, like how is air pollution related to hospitalization rates. So we have two variables, both of which have a spatial component, and we might want to make inferences about association between them. Then typical or like commonly used methods for constructing confidence intervals for this association can lead to confidence intervals that almost never contain like the actual strength of the association when we have this non-IID sample. Yeah.
Just to make sure I'm understanding the setting correctly, are we thinking of the individual hospitals as like our individual observations, and then the air pollution, if we could measure it at the location of that hospital? Or are we looking at like an individual level data set?
We're thinking of this as a hospital.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so right.
We're
like in-
assuming that the air pollution at the hospital is representative of the air
Yeah.
pollution exposure.
So in an ideal world, you would have like exposure
Right.
data,
It's-
right?
yeah.
And like have people wearing something. Also, like we're just focusing
Yeah.
for this hypothetical on outdoor air pollution, right? And indoor
Yeah.
air pollution. Yeah.
Totally makes sense. Okay, I just want to make
Yeah.
sure I understood the.
Yeah. So this is going to be our running example. But, yeah. So we develop a method that reliably estimates prediction error, and also methods that quantify inferential uncertainty in a setting where we have this non-IID data. And we want to draw inferences at potentially different places in space than where we have observation data available. Yeah, so as I touched on at the beginning, we're going to use air pollution as a running example. Later when I show an experiment, it will be with temperature data, but there are also applications in economics, psychology, or weather. Yeah, so for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus on these questions about validation, and then just at the end, I'll touch on some on this inference question in constructing confidence intervals. I'm gonna begin by taking a step back and think about like why we do validation to begin with. And I'm gonna argue that it's an estimation procedure and there's some quantity we want to estimate. And then we can ask questions about whether we're estimating it well or not. So now as an example of a case where kind of classic validation might make a lot of sense to do, we'll think about wanting to label bird species. And so we can imagine we have a bunch of unlabeled images of birds. Someone gives us an image classifier that wasn't trained on these birds, and we want to use it to label these birds. So we get a bunch of labels out from just running from classifying the images. And the question then we want to answer is, should we trust the predictions made by this classifier? So typically what we would do is we might sample n of these birds. In this case, I've labeled 3. To label manually, these would become our validation data. So these now are labeled, and we can check how well the classifier does on these labeled examples. We would calculate its error on the labeled data. So in this case, I got 1 of the 3 examples wrong, so it had an error of 33%. And this is actually serving as an estimate for its error on the population of all the unlabeled images that we have. It might be a good estimate, it might be a bad estimate. And there's this assumption that is almost always made sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, but the sample data is independently and identically drawn from whatever population we care about estimating the method's error on. And in this case, it's a totally reasonable assumption because we had, at least if we sampled with replacement, we had some larger number of examples and we get to pick. And in particular, you can show that under this assumption, it's a consistent estimate of error. So if you were to sample n, you were to make n larger and larger, you would get a better estimate. There's a lot more you can say about the estimator in this case, but that's kind of a key property I'm gonna focus on for this talk, is that if you had enough data, you would be able to estimate how you're doing in this prediction as well. So why doesn't this directly translate to our spatial setting? So as I've already tried to argue, the prediction locations are rarely, independently and identically distributed in some meaningful sense. So again, we have these hospitals, right now I'm showing hospitals in California, and they're not really coming from some larger population. And validation locations aren't either. So you can imagine, for example, for administrative reasons, we might only have access to air pollution monitors in New England. And, I think it's pretty unreasonable to think that even if we had a lot of air pollution monitors available in New England to validate the quality of our predictions of air pollution, we'd be able to get good estimates for what's going on in California. There's really different environmental considerations. So like wildfires are a much bigger issue in California than in New England. So there's a lot of reasons why, calculating our prediction error there might not be informative of the places where we care about for the purposes of the study. So we had this idea of consistency from a previous slide, which I think is like a minimal desirable property when you're going to do validation. If you get enough data, you should be able to estimate things well. But in these spatial settings, we need a definition that accounts for kind of this non-random spatial location. And so we need to somehow adapt our definition to make more sense. Because if we were to just get more samples, like I've now shown in New England, we still wouldn't necessarily estimate the error any better in California. So the definition we propose is kind of borrowing ideas from a lot of older work in the spatial statistics literature, which is this idea that if we had data available densely in space, we should be able to estimate the error well. So now I've drawn back on the air pollution monitors throughout the country, and you can imagine if we were to place a bunch more monitors, then our estimate of the model error in these hospitals should get better and better. Okay. So this is kind of what we propose as a minimal desirable property if you're going to do validation in spatial settings. And next I'm going to talk about some existing methods and give some intuition for why they don't satisfy it. Yeah, please do.
Assuming you just take enough monitors, eventually have a monitor at basically every hospital, so you'll basically.
Yeah, so yeah, in our model, there's some noise, like the measurements aren't perfect, right? There's some sampling variability. I think it'll become more clear in a few slides. If it's not clear, like it's, but yeah. But no, it's definitely true. Yeah, and that's like the intuition. Okay, so the simplest thing you would think to do is to just use this hold-up approach we discussed before. Take the empirical average of a prediction error of validation models. So I've switched everything to be one-dimensional, like to only have one spatial dimension. Everything works in more dimensions, I just can't draw in more dimensions. So now I've drawn on some average air pollution, which you can imagine is some function over space. In blue, we don't get to observe this function. And so then we have some predictor for air pollution, some prediction of the air pollution over space. We could get this from some machine learning method. It could be some physical model. So I think those are really commonly used in this space. You could also think of using some other statistical model. We have these hospitals, which are these red points, and our goal is to estimate the error at these red hospitals. In yellow are kind of some available validation monitors, and then the yellow circles show the air pollution at those monitors. So this is just taking a simple average of the error. So the distance, or I guess in this case, the root mean squared error between the orange curve and these yellow points. And we could think about adding more yellow points and more yellow points, and we see that this kind of root mean squared error still isn't converging to the actual estimate. So the actual estimate is shown as a red bar on the right, and the root mean squared error, which it would be our estimate of it, is isn't converging. And why is that? It's basically because this is a biased estimate. So even though the samples are becoming dense in space, we have more of them kind of on this in the middle and right-hand side of my plot. And those are places where our predictor was doing better. And the points where we cared about in this case were on the left-hand plot, where it's not doing as well. So we have this bias, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just having a little trouble understanding. So as you're adding more yellow points, presumably you could then improve your estimate or improve your predictions, or is that not happening here and you're just?
Yeah, no, I'm assuming the predictor is fixed.
So the prediction is
The
fixed.
prediction is fixed, so it's, yeah.
Okay.
So we're asking for just consistency of estimate of a fixed predictor. Maybe it's easiest to think of your predictor as coming from like a physical model, right? Where you're running some simulation to produce PM 2.5 estimates. You can ask what would happen if we had lots of monitor data available.
I'm still confused, but we can go on.
Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, so, okay, so the predictor is still this orange curve. Yeah, okay, wait, maybe one thing that's helpful to say is in all these setups, I'm imagining that the monitors we have available are only gonna be used for validation, they're not used for training.
Okay, so the yellow points have no bearing
On the
on
orange
the
curve.
orange.
No, the only goal is to assess the error of this orange curve.
I see.
Yeah, it's
So-
always fixed.
So that makes sense.
Yeah. And so another thing you could do is think, which I think is getting at the point you were making before, that you could use the nearest monitor to each hospital. And this is actually known to under kind of like standard covariate-shift assumptions where all your data is coming IID from two separate populations. You have lots of examples. This is known to be a good estimator because we're showing that it has good statistical properties. So we could think about taking the empirical error of the average. The empirical average of the error at the closest monitor to each hospital. And then we could, again, add more monitors and add more monitors. And the issue we're going to run into is that this is a high variance estimate. And it's basically a high variance estimate because we're assuming there's some amount of noise in the data generating process, and you would want to average over this noise. So your measurement of air pollution is not perfect. And so it's going to be basically inconsistent for that reason. And so kind of as an informal proposition, we give examples showing that both these methods, as well as a bunch of other approaches based on like nearest neighbors ideas, can be inconsistent even as you have data that becomes dense. So even as this like monitoring data becomes dense spatially. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the process that's adding more of these monitors? Because I think you said it wasn't uniform, but that it was gonna eventually cover everything, like what are the assumptions on that?
The only assumption on the locations of monitors is that they eventually become dense in space. So it can be any sequence that's eventually dense in space. There's other assumptions about the data generating process that are, I would say, like fairly standard. Like I'm going to get into one non-standard assumption on the next slide, but I think everything else would be, yeah.
I think I understand now, but I just want to confirm my understanding that the issue you're showing here is that if you have a fixed prediction and to assess if that's a good prediction, you just grab random data for your validation set.
Yeah.
It's not going to represent an error on once you.
Yeah, that's definitely what the
Okay,
first
I
one is, yeah. And then the second one is like, if you just grab the closest one, that doesn't fix it. You have to account for the variance.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is an intuition that everyone has had that like is kind of, or like several people have brought up, which is that nearby locations should have similar errors, right? And so on this slide, basically what we're gonna do is try to formalize that intuition and then build a method based on that intuition that addresses the problem. So on the point, or on the drawing on the left, I've drawn on this root mean squared error, which is like basically we want to estimate the root mean squared error at these two hospitals. That's this green curve at the bottom. Or we want to estimate the average of those two hospitals. And I've shaded a yellow region next to each of the hospitals, which we can think of roughly as nearby. And so the idea is going to be to borrow information across nearby locations. The formal assumption we're going to make is that the average error, so in this case the root mean squared error, which is some function of space, varies Lipschitz continuously as a function of space. And all that means is that if you were to move, for example, 1 kilometer in space, then maybe your error in your prediction of air pollution would change by at most, some L micrograms per meter cubed. I think it's a bit strange to make an assumption on the error of a model versus on physical processes involved. And so we show that if a true predictor is Lipschitz as a function of space, and the average of a true underlying process is also Lipschitz continuous as a function of space, then the error will be as well, at least for nice enough losses. And that's basically just trying to, we want to be able to reason about the data we have and not about some derived quantity. And so that's kind of the point there. I think this assumption or something like it kind of has to be there to formalize this intuition that nearby points are useful. You can imagine if we had some other, and there are places where, or in types of air pollution, where it varies over very short length scales relative to the types of measurements we have available. And then, even if we had a lot of monitors available, for example, it wouldn't tell us much about what's going on at the points we care about. So there's problems where this spatial smoothness assumption is the right thing to make. It's not always the right thing to make, but we probably need something kind of like it if we're going to move away from this IED setting. One thing is, for our method to be consistent, we don't need to know the actual Lipschitz constant, which I think is a big plus. You might get more efficiency if you did know the Lipschitz constant, but it's not necessary, I guess, for the method to at least be consistent. So now I'm going to describe the method. I'm going to do it at a fairly high level, but hopefully you can get the intuition across. And the whole idea is to balance this bias variance trade-off. And so we're just going to select a number of neighbors in a way that balances bias and variance. And so we're kind of, another way of thinking about that is we're going to control the size of the area we average over to borrow these. So we again have our sequence, or our set of monitors, and I'm going to again add more monitors. There's actually right now a bunch of monitors on the right-hand side, and our method wouldn't use these. Right now it's doing the exact same thing as the one nearest neighbor approach that I talked about earlier. It's just using the closest monitor to measure, to estimate air pollution. And then as you add more, okay, sorry, something went wrong with this animation, but okay. If you were to add more monitors, it would basically average over a smaller area. And so you can imagine basically at some point it's going to use 2 monitors, for example, next to each thing, because the Lipschitz assumption is going to control the amount of bias you would introduce by doing that. And then eventually it's going to use kind of more and more of these monitors. So it's going to average over a lot of monitors, but in a small area near each of these points we care about. And the way we do this mechanistically is we select a number of neighbors. We still use this nearest neighbor approach, but we just select a number of neighbors by minimizing a bias term plus a variance term to balance this trade-off. And we show that this method is consistent under info asymptotic. So regardless of how your sequence of locations accumulates in space, as long as it's eventually dense, the method will be consistent.
Can you give some intuition? So as I get more and more air pollution stations,
Yeah.
does my neighborhood in terms of number of neighbors get bigger or smaller?
No, your neighborhood should get smaller,
Okay,
at least eventually. Your neighborhood is going to go to 0 eventually, right? And that's what that bias term is
0 in
doing.
distance or 0 in terms of number of
0 in
neighbors?
distance. Yeah,
Okay.
the number of neighbors is going to increase.
But the number of neighbors, I will select more neighbors, but they'll be closer to me.
Yeah.
That's-
Yeah, and that's
So that's
possible
like I'm
because of the
averaging
neighbors
kind of
assumption.
over a bigger sample.
Yeah.
Like I'm getting more and more things, so I'm averaging over a big sample of things, but they're all near me, so.
Yeah, if it's
Okay.
useful intuition, the same thing happens in like regression problems typically when you do nearest neighbors, like if you were to do nearest neighbors regression and try to pick like the optimal. You would end up with something kind of similar if you were trying to just do regression. It's like you again have like a bias and variance trade-off. The bias and variance trade-off is different than in our problem, but it's this thing conceptually.
Will each red point have the same number of neighbors eventually, or well, I guess not
Yeah,
eventually.
so in our setup right now, it will. And I think this is potentially a place where there's probably something to do that's better than that, because you can imagine spatial scales are often different in different parts of your domain. So like using this like running example of air pollution, we might expect in urban areas, air pollution varies over like shorter scales than in rural areas, because you might have like local sources like highways, and probably incorporating that kind of domain knowledge would be useful.
I guess if you had a sequence of like fill-in points where a bunch more landed near one versus
Yeah.
another.
Yeah, that's also true. We're also, yeah, so it's gonna be kind of worst case. Yeah. There's some easy ways to improve that, I think. I think that they become computationally expensive, and I think there's a question of like, in practice, is it worth the extra computation? But yeah, definitely we can chat more about that. Okay, so far I've just been talking about consistency, and I think as many of you have pointed out, like we don't have dense data. That's not what we have in real life. So this is just kind of like an abstraction of like a minimal desirable property. And the question then we want to ask is like, does any of this matter in practice? In the paper, we have a bunch of simulations. The challenge is always that like for real data generating processes, for real data, we don't know the actual error of a prediction method. If we did, we would be done. And it's kind of even a worse problem than like evaluating the quality of evaluation of a method is almost like a worse problem than evaluating that predictions typically, in terms of like controlling the data generating process. So we have a bunch of simulations and then doing things like bootstrapping, or like resampling approaches to generate like semi-synthetic data. And what we find is that our method is consistently accurate, and there are cases where the baseline methods fail. What I want to talk through is kind of the more interesting question, I think, which is what happens in real data and whether any of this matters. Because you can imagine, like if you go and look at real data and all the methods either return the same estimate or at least like rank different ways of making predictions the same, then maybe none of this like matters. And so we look at this air temperature prediction task, where basically the goal is to predict air temperature based on I think so there's two prediction methods. One is geographically weighted regression, which you can think of as like a local version of linear regression, where you weight data that's nearby more heavily. It's using as an input like basically air temperature or surface temperature measurements from satellites. So satellites can measure, if anyone does remote sensing, my apologies, but satellites can measure like surface temperature, I think, fairly well, but not air temperature, because okay, now I really don't know enough about remote sensing, but so it's using that as a predictor. And then the second method is just like a Gaussian process where we've like taken a subsample of weather stations and just interpolated them. And so I'm showing the mean absolute error of both these methods as calculated by each of these validation methods. So the first one is the holdout. So this is if we just take an unweighted average. The data is coming from across the US. We're interested in prediction in 5 metro areas. And you can see that the holdout would say that geographically weighted regression has the lower error. If we use one nearest neighbors, we would reach the opposite conclusion, that this Gaussian process method has the lower of the 2 errors. And if we use our method, we actually agree with the holdout approach and think that geographically weighted regression has the lower error. And because we both have theory supporting the use of our method, and then also a bunch of simulation studies where we can check that it's actually performing consistently well. I think it's reasonable to think that geographically weighted regression is actually performing better at this task. Yeah.
Naive question, so do you have a sense of how the results would change if you did hold out, but just on California, like restricting
Yeah.
the?
That's a good question. I think in general, if you probably do some form of geographic restriction, it's gonna help. I think it depends like what's driving, in this case, what's driving the bias. It's like one thing, yeah, so certainly in the air pollution example, I think it has to help. I think though, like you still are gonna have this like urban rural issue
Yeah.
which is gonna drive like still, I think, pretty significant differences. But yeah, I think it's definitely like a sensible thing, and that's, I think you see in a lot of papers, they'll like restrict geographically to some region. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna, if there's any more questions on validation, I'm gonna step to talking briefly about trying to do inference and like quantify uncertainty for spatial associations. So, okay. So often we want to not just make predictions in space, but we also want to infer things about variables that vary over space. We again had this running example of the relationship between air pollution and hospitalization rates. You can imagine doing something like Poisson regression in this case, because the hospitalization rates are going to be count data, and air pollution is, perhaps continuous. But basically we want to understand the relationship between these two things. And we still have locations where we observe data, which aren't independently and identically distributed. And also we might want to draw inferences at particular points in space. So now instead of making predictions, we want to draw inferences. But these might be like at particular locations. We might care about the, again, like in the running example, we care about air pollution on hospitalizations in these rural areas. So it has some place associated with that. And we're also going to run into this issue that models are misspecified, which is basically always the case in real life. So often we might fit a linear model, not really because we believe the relationship is linear, but because we want some numerical summary of the relationship between these variables, and it's kind of a useful tool for doing that. So if you have this combination of model misspecification and then also this non-random, so this IID assumption doesn't hold, so your data is, for example, fixed. We show that standard confidence intervals, methods for constructing confidence intervals can fail. So now on the right, I'm showing the coverage, which is just the percent of the time that the confidence interval contains the true parameter. This is on simulated data, so we know the true parameter. The x-axis is showing basically something which is controlling an amount of shift we have between the points where we observe data and the points where we want to draw inferences. So you can think about either moving to the far right or to the far left as introducing more shift into the problem. The white line is this nominal coverage. So this is what we are reportedly constructing, in this case, 95% confidence intervals. The blue line is the most naive thing you can do, which is just return a point estimate. Of course, it never contains the true parameter because it's just a point estimate. And then the other curves, the red and green curves are both ordinary least squares. The green curve uses this sandwich covariance estimate, which is known to be robust to misspecification, but isn't robust to a combination of misspecification and non-random sampling. And the orange curve is an importance weighting approach, which is basically reweighting examples to try to balance the distribution where you observe data to the distribution where you want to, the locations where you have data available to locations where you want to draw inferences, and you can think about this as kind of a so as well as caring about coverage, we typically care about confidence interval width, because this is going to basically determine the power of like our ability to draw conclusions. So you can see in this case, of course, the point estimate has a confidence interval width of 0. So it's doing very well from a perspective of having a small confidence interval width. But we kind of argue that you should only care about methods with narrow confidence intervals if they also obtain, something close to nominal coverage. Of course, it's easy to return uncertainty estimates that are very confident if you don't care if they're actually quantifying uncertainty problem. So we develop methods that replace basically these IID assumptions with smoothness assumption, like the Lipschitz assumption I was talking about earlier, to produce provably conservative confidence intervals. So you can see our method now does obtain nominal coverage. In fact, it overcovers slightly, and that's kind of this conservative element. We also then end up with much wider confidence intervals, perhaps not surprisingly. We also have some examples kind of showing that these confidence intervals aren't so terribly wide as to be useless in cases. Like there are cases where you still have enough power to kind of identify something interesting. I'm just going to take a step back now and kind of wrap up. So we had this motivating question of what is the impact of air pollution on hospital admissions? And we focused on building tools for validating these like machine learning predictions or quantifying uncertainty when we have this non-random sampling. These approaches have kind of relied on this idea that we have data available in lots of different points in space, which, yeah, as we've already discussed, this idea of having like relatively dense data can be an issue. One thing that would help a lot is if we had tools that leverage multi-fidelity data for validation. So right now, the air monitors I'm showing are just the EPA monitors, which are kind of like the gold standard measurements of air pollution. There's also a whole network of purple air monitors, which are low-cost monitors that like you could go out and purchase. And they actually have much better spatial coverage, but they also are known to have like biases in measurement, as well as like more, like they both have more uncertainty in measurement and also like biases that differ depending on the situations they're in. So one thing that we're thinking about pretty actively is developing tools that leverage multi-fidelity data for validation. So there's a lot of work on multi-fidelity modeling focused on improving prediction, but it would be nice to have similar tools for validation. You can also think about trying to like leverage remote sensing data in places where we really don't have high or low quality monitors. And then, of course, one of the big questions is how do we test how well we're doing when we move to extrapolating in space? So as an example now, here are the these rural hospitals kind of shown across the entire US. You see that even if we were able to leverage these low fidelity monitors, there'd be a lot of parts of the country where we still just don't have any monitoring available, as particularly in the middle in Nebraska and Kansas and Texas. And so having tools that test the ability of spatial models to extrapolate in a really mathematically grounded way, I think would be really useful. And I think the challenge is that smoothness alone, like this kind of assumption, isn't enough to get us there. We need some other form of assumption, whether it's stationarity or mixing, or probably some combination of all three. So I think that's a direction that we're pretty actively thinking about. So these were the works I was talking about, as well as one work, which was an applied work looking at evaluating PM 2.5 forecasts from a perspective of individual decision making. The bottom two are these works that I kind of just touched on about confidence intervals for spatial associations. So thank you for listening, and yeah, happy to take questions now or send them after.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Do we have any questions from the audience?
For the confidence interval plots, you were mentioning that like the center was no skew and then left and right were different kinds of skew.
Yeah.
But the behavior was like very asymmetric left and right. Can you say something about like what was that difference, and does that tell you something more general about like when your methods work well versus not?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of basically we were sampling like from a unit square and we're moving the data where we wanted to make predictions, I think, to the top right, to the bottom left. If your data generating process were perfectly symmetric, then you would get a symmetric plot here. And I think in one of our experiments it is, but like, unless your data has some symmetry that matches how you're shifting the locations, you like in general shouldn't expect it to be symmetric in this case. So I think the asymmetry comes more from like particularities of the data generating process and like some like more profound thing, yeah.
Thanks for the talk, it's really cool stuff. I was wondering since we have a bit of time, like, I'm curious about a little bit more in like understanding of how this nearest neighbor algorithm works. So just in terms of like, I'm curious about a couple of things. One, I was like surprised that, all right, I'm imagining I have a real data set and now I have to choose a number of neighbors. Like, how do I do that? I don't know the Lipschitz constant. How can I balance the bias and variance? I don't have much intuition for that.
Right, so what we do is you kind of try to guess the Lipschitz constant on the right order of magnitude. We show it's consistent even if you just use one, but if you can kind of get on the right order of magnitude, it probably won't make a big difference, I think is what we found. Your estimator then is it's some linear combination of the errors at the points where you actually observe data. And so you can write it as like some weighted combination of these points. What we do is basically we write down a high probability upper bound on your error, which you can do because there's the Lipschitz assumption controls the bias of your estimator. And then I guess you need some tail assumption on your loss. We assume your loss is a bounded function. You could assume it's sub-Gaussian and do the same thing mechanically. So you write down a high probability upper bound and then you minimize this high probability upper bound with respect to the weights. And basically we do that search for all possible number of neighbors, or in practice we do like a binary search over a number of neighbors. Does that start to? So like basically we write down a high probability upper bound on the error of your estimate for estimating error, and then we minimize it with respect to the number of neighbors.
Okay, and like in that upper bound, you have some information about the bias coming through the Lipschitz constant.
Yeah.
What about the variance? Do you know the noise variance of the measurements, or are you estimating that?
Yeah, we don't estimate it. So we're using something that's kind of worst case in this setting. We're using that our loss is bounded. And so that basically that's enough. Like, yeah, we have an upper bound on the loss. And that's kind of enough to control a tail behavior. If you were to, you could also think about trying to do a Gaussian approximation, estimating it. And estimating the variance on top of it. I guess then you have to worry about how well you estimate the variance, but you might still be able to get consistency out. Sounds kind of reasonable.
Okay, great, thank you.
So as somebody who comes at this from more of the statistical background, I think what I find just most fundamentally confusing is, I guess, the idea that like, I guess when I see these problems in statistics, usually everybody knows you can't assume stationarity over large spatial regions. So they would have just cut up the field from the start.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm a little confused about like, is the problem really that the estimator is bad or that it's a good estimator of the wrong thing? Because.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I think both,
Okay.
right? I think it's.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think you're right? It's definitely, it's estimating the wrong thing. It is converging to something.
Yeah.
It's converging to the wrong thing.
Yeah. And what is really challenging in spatial settings is like you need to think about the population in a way that you don't have to think about the population. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that's basically.
It's very good to think about it from another perspective too, which we totally negative.
So you see like this near neighbor thing, it doesn't really have anything to do with estimating error, like you could use it to estimate any Lipschitz function, right? I mean, your application is to estimating error, but like you could use it in any setting where I have a fixed set of points where I want predictions, and I have a distribution, even if we're in your case, not even a distribution, but let's say just have a distribution of training points that are coming at me that I get labels for, and I wanna like estimate at that fixed set, you could use this type of approach, right?
Yeah, so it's pretty similar to how you would do Lipschitz regression.
Okay.
Which I think is what you're kind of saying. I think the difference is that because we're interested in estimating the error for prediction method, we're doing this additional averaging step over the hospitals in this case.
Oh, sure, so you're not trying to get good estimates at each hospital?
Yeah, and so it
Okay.
changes the bias variance straight off of it.
I see, okay,
Like you care less about the variance in the end
Okay.
because you get to do some additional averaging.
okay, that makes sense, got it, thanks.
Hello. Maybe this is an aspirational question, but you gave that example at the beginning with the evaluating the performance of like an image classifier. Do you think like, since there's a lot of these models that can compute these like compressed like image embeddings that sort of represent the content of the image? And like they kind of have this structure where like if two images are similar in appearance, then they would have like similar embeddings. So I was just wondering, do you think there could be some space where like you would apply this method instead of varying spatially, you're like varying over like how similar the image embeddings are in order to say like, oh, these two images are similar, so maybe the performance will be similar?
Yeah, so I think I'm like a bit reticent. I feel like the trick is always like the goal in this case is to have as like physically interpretable an assumption also as we can, right? So it's like, it's somewhat easier to talk about like, oh, how quickly could some physical process vary over space than to talk about, at least I don't feel confident talking about like, what's a reasonable, like, is it reasonable to assume images are varying kind of smoothly in this embedding space? I don't really know. So I think that's mostly my reticence. Yeah. And I guess it's worth also thinking about like what the sampling mechanism is. Like should we be worried if data is IID or not? Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It depends on your actual application.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You talked mostly about the spatial validation and for non-IID data sample there. I'm curious to know if all of your propositions and properties would also apply to temporal data, especially if you're sampling in non-regular intervals, would it apply to like sensor data and correlations across time?
Yeah. So the straightforward way of extending things would be to treat time in the same way you treat space, assume some smoothness over space and time jointly. That's what I think. I think it depends what your task is. If you're doing some form of reanalysis, meaning like you have data, like you're trying to figure out what happened in the past and you have data at pretty short, like a pretty high temporal resolution, then maybe it's reasonable. I think often people want to do some form of forecasting and understand what is my prediction error going to be in the future. And I think in that setting, we're still like thinking about tools for that. That kind of falls into this like extrapolation category because you are predicting forward in time. And so once you're predicting kind of forward by more than an amount of time where you expect things to have changed, you don't really know how you're going to do. There's no mechanism in kind of our analysis to say that like your historical performance is going to tell you about your future performance. Does that help? Yeah, thanks.
If you have more questions. Okay, if not, then let's thank our speaker again.